Let's take a look at fabric selection. The pattern calls to use 16 different fabrics, as you can see here. I'm going to show you how you can use it using your scraps and using a variety of fabrics, or you could use all one fabric. It's important when you're using a variety of fabrics that you look for balance in your overall quilt. The pattern is going to have 16 blocks, 4 across and 4 down. Here I've chosen 4 different fabrics: whites, reds, grays, and pinks. And within those fabrics, I have 1 light and 1 dark and 2 medium of each. So I know that my quilt's going to have balance. So if you're using a variety of fabrics, try to make sure you're using roughly the equal number of each fabric, or that at least you're making sure that your values have about the same number of lights as you do darks, as you do mediums of each. For example, if you had a quilt that was all dark, say maybe 14 dark blocks and only 2 light blocks, those 2 light blocks are going to really jump out. So if you want your quilt to look harmonious, make sure to balance those values in the colors. If you do not want to use 16 different fabrics, you can change that to 8 different fabrics and 2 blocks of each, or you could change any combination that you like. Or, as I've done over here on my other design wall, I've chosen a fabric that I really like. It's a large scale print, and that when I cut it into the 5.5-inch squares, it's going to have enough differentiation between all the blocks that they're not all going to look alike. However, if you did all want your blocks to look alike, that's fine. For example, if you wanted a simple 3-color quilt, you could easily do that. 1 color for the blocks, 2 colors for the 4 X's, and the next thing you know, you have a sweet little 3-color snowball quilt. For the purpose of our video today, I'm going to be showing you how to make the quilt using the variety of pinks, reds, and grays, and I'm doing it as a Valentine quilt. When considering the fabrics for the 4 X's, you want to make sure you have good contrast between the 4X squares and the blocks. Now, with my Valentine selection, as I said, I had 4 gray fabrics, and I wanted to make sure that the gray and the charcoal that I had used for my X's in the corners would still have enough pattern differentiation and color differentiation that it would show up. I don't want it to blend too much. Here with my landscape fabric, I've chosen a green and an orange, but the print itself is significantly different from that that's in the fabric. So I can still see that corner, and this green is dark enough that it shows up very differently. So that would be 2 good 4X choices for this particular fabric line. When choosing fabrics for your contrast squares, I encourage you to stay away from one-way directional fabrics. That makes it very difficult when cutting them into squares and pressing them or marking them. It makes it difficult to have them all going the right direction, and it'll show up in your overall design if you have one that's kind of going the wrong direction. Let's take a look at the pattern. The pattern has an image of the overall design, and on this side here, it has the fabric requirements and cutting instructions. You'll note that under snowballs, it gives you the yardage if you're using 1 single fabric, or the quantity necessary if you're going to use 16 different fabrics. It also shows you that under contrast A, on the actual design, it's shown as a light gray, and contrast B is shown as a dark gray. I encourage you to take a pencil and write in under the contrast colors, the colors of fabric that you choose. It's very important to keep track of your colors that you've chosen So in the event that you're wondering which corners go where, you can always look back and see contrast A, contrast B. In the pattern, I write it out as contrast A, contrast B. But I always encourage quilters to write on their patterns and keep track of things. The pattern has a few notes to look at before you begin. And then it has detailed instructions for each step of the design. We'll go over each step as we do our class today. That continues until you have completed the overall quilt top, and you'll note that pressing instructions are always included. You don't have to press the directions that I indicate, but I'll tell you some reasons why you probably may want to. The last page of the pattern includes the borders, tells you to layer your quilt top, your batting, your backing, quilt it, and then bind. I don't give any specific instructions on how to bind. Let me show you a tip on cutting the 2-inch squares. When cutting your units, I encourage quilters to never use their mat to determine the width of the cut. Mats, as we use them with our rotary cutters and our rulers, every time we make a cut on that mat, even when it's a self-healing mat like this one is, every time we make a cut, we distort the measurement. And so that measurement may not be true. So I always encourage quilters to use not the mat, but the actual ruler itself as the measurement. When you're wanting to make a precise cut for a small piece, like a 2-inch square, that you will later have to fold or mark in half so that it makes a nice, perfect corner, it's important that you use a marking that you can see well. You can see on this ruler that at the 2-inch mark, it's a thicker line. And I can be off as much as a 1/16 or a 32nd of an inch if I were to use this ruler when I'm making that cut. So one of the things that I do sometimes is I will take a ruler where it has an extra 1/2 inch, and I'll use that half line where I can see it perfectly when making that cut. Let's get started, shall we? In the initial instructions, it tells you that all 16 blocks will be constructed in the same manner. The contrast A squares, which are shown as light gray, are going in the upper left and the lower right corners of the unit, while the contrast B squares are going into the upper right and lower left corners of the unit. So let's take a look at how that would look. The contrast A squares will be placed in the upper left and the lower right-hand sections of the unit. The contrast B squares, here shown in a darker color, go in the upper right and lower left of the unit. I like to keep one of my units lying on my sewing table as I construct, so I don't make the mistake of chain piecing some of the units into the wrong corners. It's not much fun to have to tear those out. When you're using directional fabric, as I am here, it's really important to make sure that you're placing those in the direct corner, because you're not going to be able to turn your fabric to get it to look any differently. So make sure you lay one out and have it ready to go so you have a visual image as you're doing your sewing. In this section of the pattern here, it says before you begin, you need to prepare your contrast squares by placing a diagonal line on the wrong side of the fabric. So here's my contrast square that's a dark charcoal. The pattern would indicate for you to place a diagonal line on the wrong side. You can place that diagonal line using chalk or a pencil. This pencil happens to be a 3-in-1 Bowen pencil that has 3 different colors of chalk. So when I'm using dark and light fabrics, it allows me to change my chalk from a gray to a white to a pink so that I don't have to use multiple pencils. So with the 64 squares that you have for the snowballs, you can do one of a couple of different methods. You can place a ruler diagonally on the square, and make a mark that you'll be able to see as you sew. Or the method that I prefer, because it is so quick, is simply to take my square and fold it with wrong sides together. And that's important, to fold it with wrong sides together. I finger press it, and then I set my little mini iron on it for about 5 seconds, giving me a nice crisp triangle. When I open it up, I can see the sewing line because it's pressed in. The reason why I press those with wrong sides together is because when we sew it onto the block, we'll need to press that to the outside, and that press is already made for us. It makes it a lot easier for the next step. So go ahead and take the opportunity now to either mark or press all 64 of your squares. When pressing your units, when you put the 2 points together here, if you find that you don't end up with a perfect triangle, there's nothing wrong with your iron. That's the point that you need to press it open again and take a look at your cutting and see if possibly there's an error. Again, I'm using it so I can, I've got that half inch on this side and I can see my line. And sure enough, I'm long on this corner and on this corner. So with that quick correction, I can now press that seam, and it's going to make a perfect triangle this time, which will make it perfect in my snowball unit. When we take the time to correct those little small errors like that, it makes our whole quilt look better. I have all of my corner squares all pressed diagonally, and I'm ready to go ahead and stitch. So I've laid my fabric out and my squares, and I have my one sample that shows my contrast A in the left, upper left and lower right corner, and contrast B in the upper right and lower left corner. I like to use the backs of old cutting mats as sewing trays, and that way I can just take it directly to my sewing table. Now with those orange and green pieces, this fabric is directional, so I have to take a lot more care when I am putting those through my machine. I'll have to make sure that I always make sure that I have my contrast squares in the appropriate color, because the fabric itself is directional. Step 1 of the pattern calls for you to place a contrast A square in the upper left corner and the lower right corner of each 5.5 inch square. You're going to stitch diagonally. As I've shown you, you can either stitch on your marking line, or you can open and stitch on your pressing line, as I will do there. I'm going to chain piece my units, so I'm going to start by sewing my upper left first and chain piece all 16 of my units, and then I'll come down and sew my lower right. I'm going to use a neutral thread. In this case, I'm using an Orfil 58, kind of a sand color. I don't worry about getting matchy with my fabrics, because I find when I use a neutral thread, and if my tension is set correctly on my machine, thread color really doesn't make a difference. I also like to have a thread that I can see in the event that I have to tear a seam out. To stitch these diagonal lines, whenever possible, use an open-toed foot, like this foot here. With an open-toed foot, I'll be able to see the line that I've either drawn or pressed as it goes through my machine. This is an open-toed foot, but it's my 1/4 inch foot. The 1/4 inch guide will actually drag on the snowballs and actually make it more difficult to sew. So to sew my snowball, the corner squares, I'm going to use an open-toed foot, and I'll change back to my 1/4 inch foot when I'm ready to do my regular seams. If you're using a closed toe foot, such as this one, there's typically a guide that shows you where your seam should be. You'll need to make sure that that guide matches up specifically with your needle, because if it does not match up exactly, you'll be sewing off just a little bit. That's why I prefer the open toe foot. Okay, I'm going to place my stash of contrast A squares to the right of my machine and my stack of snowball squares right here where I can get to them. I always like to begin with a starter strip when I'm chain piecing. So this is the upper left-hand corner of my unit. I'm going to place the square in the corner. I don't need to pin because I can eyeball that it's sitting in there nice and square. And I'm going to stitch right on that pressed line. If you chose to mark your line, you're going to stitch right on that marked line. Stop when you get to the end and you can put the next unit in and just chain piece the units. Again, I'm placing that square directly in the corner. And stitching right on that pressed line. And I will keep going until I have all 16 units that I have run through my machine chain piecing. Once I have my chain piece units all together, I can either trim them with a scissor, or I like to use a chain ripper, which is just a seam ripper that sets in a base. And I can take those chains and just pop them apart. Then they'll be ready to feed back through my machine for the other contrast A square. Here's my beginner. Now I'm ready to put the other contrast A square in the opposite corner, which would be the lower right. Using my open-toed foot, as I did before, I'll follow the very same method of placing a square in the corner and stitching along my marked or folded line. Again, I'll chain piece to save time and thread. If you find that you have not sewed your contrast square perfectly square and straight in the corner of that snowball, when you press it, you're going to have uneven edges here and you're not going to end up with a perfectly square unit. So if you see that you've missed that on either edge, I can see it on both edges here, take the time to remove that square and stitch it in place correctly. The second part of step 1 tells you to trim the seam at 1/4 inch and press the seams open. That's going to be very important. Typically with a snowball unit, we'd press the seams to the outside, but I'll explain why we need to press the seams open in just a moment. First of all, let's go ahead and get those trimmed at 1/4 inch. Some people like to just use their scissors and eyeball it. You can do that, but that will make it more difficult when we're pressing those seams open. I like to use a ruler that has a nice 1/4 inch line. This is a Marty Michelle square up ruler, and I really like to use it for when I'm doing this sort of a method. And I'll put that 1/4 inch line right on my seam line and trim those pieces away. Turn my unit. And do the same on the opposite side. By having that true 1/4 inch, it's going to make it easier for pressing. As I said before, typically with a snowball unit, you would press to the outside and that would be the end of it. If you use the pressing method to get the diagonal, it already is partially pressed there. But because we're putting 2 snowball units together and we want those seams to not be too bulky, go ahead and press this seam open. So the way that I do that is I just finger press it first, take my small iron, set it in place, and count to 5 bananas. That's 5 seconds. I'm not using a steam iron. That way I don't introduce any stretch into my unit. Turn my unit over, finger press, set the iron in place for 5 seconds. And there we have it. I'm going to press this unit too so you can see what I mean as far as having those seams reduce the bulk. It's important to remember that we're pressing, not ironing. So we just let the iron sit and do the work. Not necessary to move it back and forth. Now, what I meant when I said reduce bulk, when we go to put our seams together, and mine will actually be the contrast unit, we want to minimize the amount of bulk that is in this seam. If all the seams were pressed to the outside, that'd be 6 layers of fabric that will have to be pressed into the next seam. And that makes it rather bulky. When we press the seams open, it will mean that at most it is 4 layers of fabric that we'll be pressing, and they'll be at a diagonal, making it easier to press that seam open. Once you have your contrast A square, each one of these squares, when you finish, should measure 5.5 inch square, just like it did when you made the unit in the first place. And when you finish trimming, your unit should measure 5.5 inch square, exactly the same size as the square that you began with. You might be asking yourself, do I really have to measure every unit? My answer is yes. I had gone through and stitched all of these units, got to my light white units and measure 5.5 inches, wait, 5 3/4 inches. Sure enough, I had made a mistake when cutting those squares, just the white squares. Now this one hasn't been trimmed yet, so that one's going to be easy to fix. I'll just take off one of the squares and I'll trim the edge. But this one has already been trimmed and pressed. Does that mean that I have to start over with a different piece of fabric? No, I'll do the same thing. I'll remove one square, I'll trim, and I'll put it back in the same place. The first thing I need to do to make this repair is press that seam closed again. Then I'll take my seam ripper, pop every 3rd thread, flip it over to the back, and pull up on the threads so that they all come out. Remember when I talked about not having matchy thread? This is exactly what I had in mind. I can see that thread easily, and I can take that off. I'll take my ruler, set it at 5.5 inches, and trim that excess off. Now I need to stitch this piece back in place. This is the wrong size of an angle, but because I used my ruler and cut off at exactly 1/4 inch, I can set my square into that corner, and it's roughly 1/8 inch here, and I can go ahead and diagonally stitch along that seam line and press, and I'll have fixed my problem and not have to start over with a new block. As you're trimming those corners off of your snowball units, what do you do with all these little pieces? They're not big enough to sew anything with. And yet, why should we just throw them in a landfill? We keep all of our small pieces in a bucket and we make dog beds for the Humane Society with those. If you don't want to make the dog bed yourself, check with your local library or with your local schools to see if you have students that might want to do the very same. Makes a nice bed for the animals and the cats and the dogs that have been rescued and they're at the Humane Society. My snowballs with contrast fabric A are all stitched, pressed, and ready to go. I'm now ready for step 2, where I'm going to take contrast B and stitch it into the opposite corners. And similar to what I did in the first step, I'm going to stitch all one corner first by chain piecing it through my machine. Then I'll stitch the second corner. Then I'll trim, press, and yes, once again, I'll measure. Once I'm at my machine, I have my contrast B squares all pressed and ready to go. They could be marked, but mine are pressed. I'll go ahead and open it up, place it in the corner of the unit so that my sides match perfectly. Fold it in place. It's not necessary to pin this. And stitch on my marked line or my pressed line. I've sewn the contrast B square into one corner, chain piece those, popped them apart, and now I'm ready to sew the contrast B square in the opposite corner. I'll chain piece those as well. Once we've stitched both contrast squares in place, it's time to trim them, press them, and get ready for the next step. We'll use the same method that we did in step 1, where we take the unit and place the 1/4 inch line of a ruler right along that seam line. And trim that unit. You'll do that for both sides. And remember, you can use those scraps to make dog or cat beds for the Humane Society. Or maybe you have a pet of your own. Once you have the seams trimmed, finger press them open and set your iron in place for a count of 5 seconds. Or 5 bananas, or 5 valentines, or 5 snowballs, whatever you have to count to 5 to get to 5 seconds. There's no point rushing through the pressing part of this because you want to make sure your seams are pressed nice and flat and straight so that the next step comes much easier for you. Once you have pressed it in place, take your ruler and measure, and your unit should measure 5.5 inches square. If it does not, you may need to do a little trimming just to make sure that you have a nice 5.5 inch square unit so that the next step comes out the way it should. Once I have all the contrast B squares trimmed and pressed, I've remeasured the blocks, make sure that I have them at 5.5 inches. I've squared them up. I'm ready to go to the design wall so I can do step 3. So now it's time to lay the blocks out. As you remember from the beginning, when we talked about the fabric, you're going to have what should be an equal amount of lights, darks, mediums. Your colors should be pretty equal. So laying out your fabric shouldn't be too difficult. But if you're like me, I can always make an easy project seem really hard. Remembering that your contrast A square goes in the upper left-hand corner, you're going to lay out your blocks and start out by just laying them in 4 rows of 4. Okay, I have fiddled and moved these around multiple times, and I think this is the layout that I want to go with for my actual quilt top. So before I start sewing, I'm going to snap a picture of it because undoubtedly I will get these out of order, and I want to make sure that I get them in the right order when I'm putting my rows together. I'm going to sew them together in vertical rows of 4. So I'll sew 4 vertical rows together. Let's begin with step 3. In step 3, it tells you to go ahead and sew your vertical pieces together, matching seams. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, on my design wall, just flip them over and pop a pin in them so that they stay in sets of 2, making it easier for me to put it through my machine and chain piece them. Remember, I have that picture, so I'll be able to determine if I get any of my pieces out of order. I'll go ahead with this first block set and show you how I pin it together so that when I stitch it, my seams match up perfectly or near perfectly. This is the side. I made my sandwich going this way, and I'll just double check and make sure I have my light contrast in the upper left and bottom right and my dark in the opposite corners so that they'll come together. And what I want to do is I want to match these seams so that the diagonal seams match perfectly. Remember, we press these seams open to eliminate bulk. Once we have stitched our 2 units up together, we can open them up and we can see that our corner pieces should match perfectly. If they do, then we pinned it properly and we stitched it properly. We can press that seam open. So remember how I had you pressing these open? By doing that, we have less bulk right here to press that seam open. Otherwise, we would have really struggled with getting a nice press if we had 6 layers of fabric. And again, you're going to hold that iron in place for a count of 5 seconds. We're not ironing, we're just pressing. And that unit's ready to sew to the second unit to complete the row. The second unit, however, I did a nice job of pinning those corners, but look here, I missed. Now, I can make a decision to leave that in place just as it is, or I also can see that I'm over here. I could easily slide that up and ease that in so that it fits perfectly. So I'm going to take the moment to go ahead and take that apart and stitch it correctly. So now that I've restitched that seam, now it matches up perfectly and I'm ready to press that. So here are the two block sets of the first row. And the question would be, is that the order I had them in? No. Is that the order I have them in? I don't know. Well, this is where getting my camera out is very helpful. There, that's the order I had them in. Now I'm ready to pin those in place and stitch them. Once you have the two units together, open them up to make sure that your seams match nicely on their diagonals. And then you can finger press and press that open for a count of 5 bananas or 5 valentines or 5 snowballs. You want a nice flat seam. And if any of your other seams have gotten wiggled around in your pressing, straighten them out now. But you want a nice flat seam so that when your unit is finished, it will lay nice and flat. I'm going to put this back on the design wall and finish the other rows of 4 to finish step 3. We're ready to move on to step 4. Now that I have my 4 rows stitched together, and I've used the picture on my phone to make sure I have them laid out the way I like them, it's my last chance to look at my design and decide if I really like the way it looks. It's also my last chance to make sure that I have everything matched up as far as my contrast A squares in the proper corners and my contrast B squares in the proper corners. Nothing's worse than putting that whole quilt top together and realizing you have one block in backwards. So now's the time to take a good look at it and see how everything matches up. In order to stitch the rows together, we have to pin matching these center seams. I'm going to show you a little trick I use using a fork pin. You can use a traditional pin, but it is a little easier to match when you're using a fork pin. I'm going to start with rows 1 and 2, and I'll press those. I'll do rows 3 and 4, and I'll press those. And then I'll put the top and the bottom half together to form the quilt top. This is my first and second row of the quilt top. I have laid it over like a sandwich. Row 1 flips over on top of row 2. The first thing I'm going to pin are going to be my flat center seams between the contrast A and contrast B square. For these seams, I like to use a fork pin. A fork pin is a 2-headed pin that has a little spot you can hold on to. And when I put those 2 seams together, matching that center seam, I can take the fork pin and stick it into that seam so that one of the pins goes on one side of the seam and one on the other side. Now you can do the same thing if you're just using traditional pins. Match that seam, place the pin in the selvage that's on the top as it's going to go through your machine. It's on the uphill side of the seam. Never place the pin directly in the seam or below the seam. If you place it in the uphill side of the seam, it will hold those selvages in place so that when you stitch to that seam, it will stay in place. Here's my third seam. Here's my fork pin, and I can easily pin that on both sides of the seam. Once we have the center seams in place, I still have to match up the contrast A and contrast B squares. Don't think that just because you've got that in place, they're going to match up nicely. You want to do the very same thing you did before, feeling the seams and visualizing the seams. putting that pin in the uphill side of the seam, and you're going to want to pin each of these. If you don't pin each of them, I can just about guarantee when you finish, you're not going to like the way those 4X's match up, and you're going to want to take the seam apart. I'm watching my 1/4 inch quite closely to make sure that I'm stitching it at a true 1/4 inch. Removing my pins before I get to them. Okay, so now if we have pinned and sewn this properly, when we open it up, our center seams should all match up. And our 4X's should all match up. And I like to double check mine before I press it to make sure I can see that I've got a spot there. I have to decide if I want to go ahead and make that match up a little better. Sometimes when I'm doing a quilt, I might decide that that matches up well enough that I don't need to take that out. I have to remember this is going to be on my table. So people are going to be within a foot or two of the actual item, and they're going to be able to see if my seams don't match quite perfectly. So I think I will take the opportunity to take that out, move it down just a little bit. Let's take a look to see if that turned out any better. It sure did. I just moved that down so that it was 1 stitch closer. Everything else matches up nice and cleanly. I'm going to go ahead and press those seams open like the pattern instructions say. I'll do it the same way I did before, where I finger press, first, and then set the iron in place. Making sure I count for a full 5 seconds. While that iron is setting in place, I can use my fingers to finger press the next section. Okay, one last look at it to make sure everything looks good. And then I'll put it back up on the design wall and get the lower half of the unit out and pin it and get it ready to stitch. Similar to the top half, I'll do the very same thing where I'm going to match up those center seams first, pin, then match up the diagonal seams, pin the outside edges, and run it through the machine at a 1/4 inch. Okay, I've got the lower half of the unit finished. Put it up on the design wall. Step back, take a look at it, see if that looks right to me. Grab my image from my camera one last time to make sure that I have everything in the right position. It looks like I do. So now I'm going to take the top half, fold it over the bottom half in a sandwich, matching all the seams up, just like I have before, and stitch them in place. It's time to add our borders. On step 5, it calls for a 20.5 inch piece to be sewn to each side of the quilt top. I recommend that you first measure your quilt top to make sure that it measures 20.5 inches long. And mine does. If your quilt top doesn't measure 20.5 inches long, you need to figure out if you need to either let out some seams or take in some seams to get it to the right length. Don't just cut off your border piece to the length of your quilt top, because what will happen is our second border, our piece border, won't fit correctly. It's really important that your 20.5 inch strip matches up perfectly with the length of your quilt. When measuring your quilt top, measure the center of the quilt top and the sides as well, because you might find that it measures differently on the sides than it does in the center. You want your quilt top to measure square. Remember, this is going to be on your tabletop or on your wall. People are going to see if it doesn't end up being square. The next thing to consider when you're looking at your 20.5 inch piece of the first border fabric is, did you measure it using your ruler or did you measure it using your mat? I like to double check my length using an actual ruler to make sure that I am truly at 20.5 inches, not 20 3/8 and not 20 5/8. It does make a difference. Too often, quilters will just take their border piece, pin it in place or hold it in place at the beginning of the seam and just start stitching. And then trim off whatever part doesn't fit. Remember, we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that this has a perfect fit. So in order for that border to fit perfectly on the sides of the quilt top, pins are our friend. We're going to start by pinning the outside edges of the border to the quilt top. So there are my outside edges. They're pinned in place. Once those outside edges are pinned in place, fold the unit in half. Use your finger to reach inside and even the border up with the side of the quilt top. Open it back up and pin that spot in place as well. I like to go ahead and pin all of my major seams. It's really important as you're stitching your border units on to make sure, because we're only dealing with 1 1/4 inches, to make sure that you don't have a spot where the border and the quilt top are not matched up evenly. So again, pins are our friends. In this case, it's going to make sure that our quilt top ends up nice and square. I'll go ahead and drop a pin where these snowballs lay, so I make sure that that border unit stays nice and even with the quilt top. Then I'll go ahead and stitch it at 1/4 inch, take it out of the machine and put the other side on as well. I have the border unit well pinned in place, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch, pulling my pins before I get to them, making sure that my 1/4 inch stays nice and true. I can feel those diagonal seams underneath, and I'm just touching on those with my finger to make sure that they stay in place as I move over the border strip. Step 6 calls for you to attach a 1 1/4 inch by 22 inch border to the top and bottom of the unit. Again, before we do that, we're going to measure our unit to make sure that it measures 22 inches. I measure through the center, the top, and the bottom. And when I have my measurements correct and make sure I don't have to adjust any seams, I'm going to go ahead and pin this border piece on exactly like I did the side borders, where I'm matching up all of the seams and all of the diagonal seams. Then I'll stitch it in place and press to the outside. Just as we did with the side borders, we're going to set the seam with the iron and then press the border to the outside. We'll do that both with the top and the bottom. And then our inner border is complete. Okay, now if we have done our measuring right and we have stitched on correctly and pressed to the outside, our total unit here should now measure 22 inches. We want to make sure that we have nice square corners on all 4 edges. So if you need to square your corner up, go ahead and do that. You should not have any leftover flaps from your border pieces because we should have measured and pinned it properly. But square those corners to make sure that they're nice and tightly squared. We're ready to move on to step 7. In step 7, it calls for you to take the remaining 1 1/4 inch strips of both your contrast A and contrast B and stitch them together into sets. Now, you might have little odd pieces of contrast A left over that are not as long as your contrast B, and that's okay. You'll just go ahead and stitch that into a set. Take your next piece, stitch it into a set, and you're going to press those seams open. To stitch those units into a set, I put my contrast B piece on the bottom because it's the longest piece. I'll trim these salvages off before we actually make our units. And I'm going to just begin by stitching those at 1/4 inch. I can see that I have my edges lined up because I don't see any of my contrast B sticking out on either side. And that's really important because this needs to be nice and square when we finish. It's not necessary to pin the units as long as you can see that you've kept your 2 strips even. When you get to where you run out of contrast A fabric, just grab another strip. And again, I'll trim the selvage off before I cut my units. All right, I have my 1 1/4 inch strip set stitched together. And now I need to press it open. And if you've done a lot of pressing of strip sets, you might notice that sometimes it seems like they take a little bit of a curve. That's because oftentimes that fabric is not real true and it's got a little bit of bias in it, but it's also because we've pressed the curve into it. Now, sometimes at quilt shows, you'll find folks trying to sell these plastic sticks that will make sure that you press your seam straight. I'm going to show you an easy way to do it. You don't have to buy a plastic stick. The straightest thing that you have in your toolbox is a ruler. So if you want to make sure that your seams stay straight, just take a ruler, lay it on your pressing mat, open up your strip set, and lay it alongside your ruler. If you do that and you keep that strip set right alongside your ruler, you'll find that as you press the seam, it will press as straight as what your ruler is. It's when we press and we let the seam move on us that it ends up getting a little bit crooked. So if you want a straight seam, press it next to a straight ruler. So I'll use that method to press the rest of my seam. And you can see how nice and straight that press is. It'll make it so that my blocks are real square when I go to cut them out.